Meanwhile, Chinese President Xi Jinping heads home today after a whirlwind tour to Europe, his first in 5 years. President Xi has been in Hungary for the final stop of his 5-day trip. He met with Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban in Budapest and said the two nations would begin a golden voyage in bilateral relations. Xi and his wife also visited Serbia and France. In Paris, President Emmanuel Macron and EU Commission Chief Ursula von der Leyen pressed Xi to use his influence on Russia to end the war in Ukraine. Let's get more from journalist Fabian Kretschmer in Beijing and DW correspondent Rosie Bashard in Brussels. Good morning to both of you. To you first, Rosie, how has the European Union seen this tour of Xi Jinping?
It's definitely been viewed from here in Brussels with a degree of wariness, and that's because the context for this trip is that the EU has been on a big mission over the last couple of years to try and decrease its dependence on China. So trying to diversify economic relations, for example. They often use this buzzword de-risking, so trying to reduce the riskiness of their economic ties. And that risk the EU sees certainly has been heightened in Brussels' eyes since that really big watershed moment, which was Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine back in 2022. Because on the one hand, while the EU has been slapping successive rounds of sanctions on Russia over that full-scale invasion, well, China, while it says it wants peace, it hasn't condemned Moscow, and on the contrary, it's really been deepening its ties. Now, while in France, President Xi will have felt some of the heat of that kind of toughening EU stance. We know President Macron pushed President Xi on trying to, France would like to see China using its influence over Russia to try and end this war. It's very unlikely that we see any big shift in Chinese policy. And then this really, I think, carefully choreographed agenda from the Chinese side meant that that was really the last time the Chinese president faced any of that sort of geopolitical pressure, because he received a much more warmer welcome in both Serbia and then Hungary. And while the EU is pushing to try and decrease this dependence, that really depends on the EU's unity.
Fabian, in Beijing, what is the message the Chinese wanted to send to Europe, and were they successful in sending it?
Well, yeah, it's really quite interesting. So Xi Jinping basically wrote an op-ed that was published both in big national media, one in France, one in Serbia, one in Hungary. And if you read that carefully, in each article he delivered exactly the message that the host wanted to hear. For example, in France he sent that he understood that the crisis in Ukraine is of big concern, and then with Macron he also said that he wants to control the export of dual-use goods to Russia, while at the same time, just a day later, in Serbia, he sent a very, very strong anti-NATO message when he visited Belgrade. And I think what he does is that he doesn't have a good record of keeping his promises, and I think the European Union is quite aware of the cozy rhetoric on the one side, but then the actions speak a different language. I just come from the European Chamber of Commerce, who published their business confidence survey, and the sentiment among the European companies here in China is on a record low, and they complain about overcapacities and Chinese industrial policy, and those issues, of course, were also talked about by Macron and Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, but it was completely dismissed by Xi Jinping. So I don't think it was very convincing. If his mission was really to convince the European Union to go on with trade as usual, I don't think it was very successful. But let me just briefly add, I think it could be seen as a win that Macron did not succeed in meeting Xi both with Ursula von der Leyen, which he did, but he also wanted to bring the German Chancellor in, Olaf Scholz, and that would have demonstrated some kind of unity. But that was not successful, and I think China really wants to play off each different interests among the EU member states.
Rosie, like France, Hungary is also a member of the EU, but Xi's tone in Hungary was markedly different to his tone in France.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Hungary is the EU country which is most often at odds with the centralised administration here in Brussels. And we heard that President Macron of France brought in the European Commission president in a bid, I think, to display unity. Well, there certainly was, according to an EU official I spoke to, no invitation from Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban for a centralised EU figure to join those talks. And indeed, the mood was very cosy. We heard that language of a golden voyage in Hungarian China ties. Now, Hungary, interestingly, from July, will take over the rotating presidency of the European Council, which gives it a greater degree of influence over the bloc's policy-making agenda. Hungary says it would like to see the EU deepen ties with China. Well, that's totally at odds with this mission that Brussels has been on to try and decrease dependence. So it really seems to me that the Chinese president has been trying to show that he will work with a Europe that wants to work with him. So if it's not been necessarily a divide and conquer mission, certainly it looks like divide and charm.
Fabian, how has this tour been viewed inside China?
Yeah, it's quite interesting that Chinese state media, they have published extensively one video clip from Xi Jinping's tour, and that was when he met Serbian President Aleksandar Vučić in Belgrade, and there were masses of people who were waving the Chinese and Serbian flag, and this goes to show that the whole Euro trip was kind of orchestrated also for a propaganda win here domestically. But if you talk to more policy experts and have a more sober assessment, then I think this trip was viewed as rather difficult, especially the stop in France, because Xi Jinping had to listen to a lot of criticism. It was not a warm, especially warm welcome, and so I think it was really half-half. So China did not give a lot of concessions, not that I could recognize, but on the other hand, did he gain a lot? I would say it's rather remaining the status quo, so it was not particularly successful.
We'll leave it there for the time being. Fabian Kretschmer in Beijing and Rosie Bashad in Brussels. Thank you both so much.